Sci-fi, horror, fantasy, absurdism in the extreme. It's all available here in the Tales from the Omni Vault book series. Check the description for Amazon links so you can get your copies and start reading today. Thank you all, and now, on to the video. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Omni Viewer, and I thought I'd only have to cover one little bit of news today, but then another bit of news dropped, so this one's going to be a twofer. So let's start with the briefer announcement. It has just been stated that Pacific Rim is going to get a prequel TV series with some sort of a first look TV deal, I guess. And this is coming after Legendary announced that they were going to do a Kickstarter to do a graphic novel that will stand in for what was supposed to be the third Pacific Rim movie that would have filled in all the gaps and finished the story after Uprising completely botched everything and made no one ever want to see another Pacific Rim movie ever again. You know, I'll give Legendary this much. They are tenacious. They are just not letting this go. They want Pacific Rim to be one of their flagship titles. But at this point, I really don't know if that is more determination or more stubbornness. I mean, admittedly, I have my own bias because I don't think Pacific Rim should have been a franchise at all. I think it should have been just the one movie, because the one movie, first of all, it was really, really good, and second, it told the complete story. We got the beginning, we learned what happened in like the backstory stuff, and then after the prologue, we had a complete tale with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the end didn't just finish that story, it finished the whole story. Was it a huge box office success? Unfortunately, no. It did not do as well as hoped for. Did people still end the year 2013 claiming that Pacific Rim was one of their favorite movies of that year? Heck yes, they did. Did it have a big impact? Absolutely. You can't really deny it. But then Uprising came along. And it was an unnecessary sequel anyway, if you ask me. Like I've said before, making a sequel to Pacific Rim is like making a sequel to Highlander. Highlander was the end of the story. What are you going to do after that? Make some kind of a Blade Runner knockoff that completely breaks the rules of the first movie and turns the Immortals into aliens for some reason? That sounds like the dumbest idea ever. Darn it all, I was kidding. But anyway, point is, it wasn't really gonna... It had the odds against it anyway, and the actual result that we got was a mess, an utter mess. And yeah, I know there are people who say that if they had made a third movie that was gonna fix everything... I don't necessarily believe that, especially not sight unseen. And the graphic novel is going to have to do a lot to prove that that would have been the case. In fact, we would kind of have to take them at their word that it would have been the original plan anyway. But the fact is, they're still trying to make it a franchise, and now we're getting a prequel TV series. Again, I don't necessarily know if we need it. Granted, if you were going to continue the Pacific Rim stuff, it makes more sense to go backward than forward. There's still a lot of stories you can tell within there, even if some of the conclusions are foregone. But, I don't know. Like I said, Uprising was a sequel that nobody liked. The Pacific Rim the Black was an anime that nobody cared for, or at least nobody watched. I know people liked it, but hardly anybody really talks about it, which should tell you how much of an impact it actually left. They tried doing a miniature tabletop game, which people, again, if they've played it, they really liked it, but otherwise it's not really gaining that much traction. And like I said, is it determination or is it stubbornness? I'm really not sure anymore. Anyway, Pacific Rim show is happening, but also we're getting the first official true MonsterVerse video game, at least the first one we've gotten in a while. I mean, there were some mobile games that were attached to Godzilla 2014, but let's be honest, most of those were just your typical mobile games, like the Candy Crush kind of things, just with a Godzilla aesthetic. I think there was that one game that you were one of the paratroopers that lands in San Francisco, although that wasn't really a huge deal. And Godzilla's 2014 design did appear in that one PlayStation Godzilla game alongside all the other classic Toho monsters and the original Toho incarnations of Godzilla as a playable character. That's the closest thing we ever got to like a proper Godzilla MonsterVerse game that people wanted to play, but it was actually also a proper Godzilla game in itself. That was rejected by a lot of people at the time, but it's gaining a better reputation from what I've heard. This, however, is the first game we'll be getting in a very long time, because when it came to Skull Island, King of the Monsters, GVK, and even technically GXK, there was nothing else. Not that that's too surprising. Officially licensed video games based on movies haven't really been a thing in a long time. For a reason, mind you. Most of the time, they are not very well received. Whether or not that's deserved is a case-by-case basis. But the general reputation is that video games based on movies are just as bad as movies based on video games. So it's no surprise that after a certain point they did kind of die off. But now here we are with a MonsterVerse video game entitled Kong's Survival Instinct. The premise here being that you're an everyday guy traveling to a distant, far-off land to scale pieces of construction in search of a woman that you care deeply about, and there's a giant gorilla named Kong in it. Which, now that I say that out loud, I can't help but feel like that's been done in a video game already. It's probably nothing. Anyway, based on the trailer that we saw, the graphics look pretty good, although I have also learned that you can't always trust a video game trailer to give you a proper depiction of what the game is going to look like. So we'll all have to reserve judgment on that until it's actually released. But the way it's depicting things looks like it's going to be a pretty interesting sort of side-scrolling platformer with some different combat elements. The big things people are talking about, though, are that this game will see the return of Alan Jonah's eco-terrorists from King of the Monsters, as well as the debut of Titanus Abaddon. Now, as far as the eco-terrorists returning, I guess since it doesn't look like they're going to come back for the movies anytime soon, using them in the game makes sense, and it's probably going to be designed to sort of wrap up that part of the storyline, like actually tell us what happened and why they didn't show up since. Although, how canon it's gonna be, who knows? Watch my levels of canon video in order to get an understanding of why this thing isn't necessarily safe. Although, who knows, it might be. Titanus Abaddon, meanwhile, actually doesn't look too bad. I was a little worried about how it might look because they were teasing it was going to be some kind of giant spider, and giant spiders are things I do not like. In a weird way, though, it's like case by case. If it's Kumonga in the original Son of Godzilla or Godzilla Final Wars, I don't mind Kumonga at all. The Mother Longlegs in Kong Skull Island, they're fine, I don't mind them. The classic movie Tarantula? Big nope. Cannot watch it. Well, I have seen it, like this, but I know it's a good movie, but I can't watch most of it because I do not like the title monster, which is why, unfortunately, you're never going to see a review of it on this channel. I'm sorry to disappoint some of you who've been waiting, but I can't do it. I'm sorry. Same goes for things like Earth versus the Spider. But so anyway, I was worried that I wouldn't be able to actually look at Abaddon. Turns out I can. He's not really a big spider. He's a big spider-like creature. Very different looking face, still recognizable base, but not the sort of thing that's going to make my skin crawl. Maybe someone else's, but who knows. He looks like he'll be good, and who knows, this might be setting up an appearance in a movie, depending on what happens in the game. But again, we don't necessarily know. I would have said that it was a low chance, but then again, Tiamat debuted in the comic Godzilla Dominion and was the first Titan to make the leap from the comics to the movies in GXK. At the same time, though, Tiamat was also heavily redesigned, making that leap, so if Abaddon does show up in the movies, he might not necessarily look like he does in the game. So, we will see. Speaking of Abaddon, I have seen people saying that they feel like Abaddon should have been Kumonga, being that he is a gigantic spider. And this is branching off of a similar argument that popped up a few weeks ago about how Tiamat should have been Manda. And I'm not really understanding why this is the case. Well, actually, I do understand, I just don't agree with the argument. See, if somebody says, these monsters should have been these classic Toho monsters instead of original ones, my question would be, what is it about these roles that would specifically require them to be the classic monsters? Look at GXK with the Mothra Phosphora thing. Just as a quick reminder, there was always the plan in place to have Mothra be in GXK, but since they weren't entirely sure they were going to get the rights, they did have a backup monster ready to go named Phosphora, who would have basically filled the same role. Ultimately, having seen the movie, I am glad they got the rights to Mothra and didn't use Phosphora, because while I'm not opposed to bringing in new monsters, the role that Mothra plays in that movie was specifically written for her. It is a role that could only have been filled by the MonsterVerse version of Mothra. If they had gone with Phosphora, we would have just been sitting there thinking, why didn't they get the rights to Mothra? Because it was clearly meant to be Mothra. You can say a similar thing about Mechagodzilla and GVK. You can't just have a generic giant robot, or even an original giant robot that might have had its own name and design and everything. It has to be Mechagodzilla because it was specifically designed to be the antithesis of Godzilla. Bring in the religious elements that have been the underpinning this series from the beginning. You also realize he's not just a robot meant to replace Godzilla, he is a false idol, a craven image of a divine being. That sort of thing. But when it comes to Tiamat, why does Tiamat need to be Manda? Because Tiamat's a big serpentine creature, and similarly, Abaddon needs to be Kumonga because he's a big spider. And there is no and. That's all it's based on, just the resemblance. There's nothing about either of them that specifically screams Toho monsters. Tiamat has no connection to Mu, is not regarded as a deity, doesn't go up against a super sub or anything. Abaddon, we don't really know much about him yet, but I can't really... I don't really know if his role needed to be filled by Kumonga or not. Maybe at one point we'll play the game and we'll all think, hey, should have been Kumonga. But at this point I don't necessarily see a reason. So, if you're just basing it on the similarity, then that's not really much of a reason in my book. But overall, I'm sure we'll get other Toho monsters at some point, because it's just a matter of, like, actually being willing to pay the rights. And since Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire actually did exceed expectations, there is a stronger chance that Legendary will be willing to splurge on another monster, whatever that might be. We'll see. Of course, there's also the question of why this is a Kong game specifically. I know a lot of people were hoping it would be a Godzilla game, or that it might be a general MonsterVerse game that had both Godzilla and Kong in it. So why focus on Kong specifically? I know there are a lot of people who are thinking that this is further evidence that Godzilla is getting phased out of the MonsterVerse somehow, just like they've been saying for years and it still hasn't happened yet. But one of these days they're convinced they'll be correct. It's a much simpler reason, I think. You see, they have to license Godzilla. You don't have to license Kong. Now, at least, okay, I've made videos about this in the past, but Due to a legal loophole that happened sometime in the 60s, no, it's not in the 70s actually, King Kong is kinda sorta public domain. Not completely. Universal technically still owns a lot of stuff regarding King Kong, but the original novelization is public domain, so technically speaking, Kong can be used elsewhere. You just can't have it be the version of Kong that Universal's got. And technically speaking, that's how Legendary was able to even make the MonsterVerse happen in the first place, and their version of Kong is their version of Kong. They don't have to license him. They technically own him outright. Which means it doesn't cost as much to make a game focused around him. To bring Godzilla into it, they would have to pay a license. And you might think, well, why not just take the risk? Like I mentioned, movie tie-in video games don't have a good reputation. And this game could still be viewed as a risk in and of itself. So if they stick with original monsters for now, and the game does well, then there might be a chance in the future for a MonsterVerse game that features Godzilla. Then again, the game has to actually be good, doesn't it? So, I mean, we don't know yet. If the game is good, and it does do well, I think the chances of getting a MonsterVerse Godzilla game in the future do increase. So I don't believe this is a sign that Godzilla is somehow getting phased out. You may recall, a lot of the plans that were being discussed before Adam Wingard departed were to have a more Godzilla-focused movie as the next entry. And I know he's departed for other projects that he was already signed on to. Doesn't necessarily mean that Legendary has abandoned that plan. We don't know. We have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. I don't have any inside information, but I've seen people spouting doom and gloom about Godzilla's role in the MonsterVerse for years, and they've all been proven consistently wrong, so I'm not going to listen to them. Either way, though, the game looks like it could be interesting, so who knows? Maybe I'll do a Let's Play of it when it comes along. We will see. I guess I'll leave it up to you guys if you want to see me do something like that. But that's all the news there is for now. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.